This is the smell of the leftover tuna fish sandwich you left in your lunchbox over the weekend in a wimpy trash bag.
Wimpy, wimpy, wimpy!
Blech! And this is the smell of that same sandwich in a hefty, ultra-strong trash bag.
Hefty, hefty, hefty!
Ah, smell the difference? Hefty Ultra Strong has Arm & Hammer with continuous odor control, so no matter what's inside your trash, you can stay one step ahead of stinky. And for bigger jobs, try the superior strength of Hefty Large Black Bags.
Hi, and welcome to the latest episode of History You Didn't Know But Should. I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
And today we're going once again back to the 19th century, and we're going to be looking at a guy that I'm sure most of our audience has never heard of. And until we did research for our episodes on Grover Cleveland, this was a man we have never heard of. But both of us agreed that when we read about him and learned about him, this was someone we had to learn more about and do an episode on. And his name was Elisha Jay Edwards. And Chris, this guy is a very important figure in the history, I guess you could say, of journalism.
You know, we go back and think about how newspapers and the printed press have come about. And we've heard of maybe writers such as Upton Sinclair, Jacob Rice. And here's an individual who actually has written extensively, so many publications that he gave. He was involved in two major scandals in the history of the United States, one of the greatest reporters that's ever been out there, and nobody knows him. Nobody remembers him except for maybe his family. And it's just one of those stories that we didn't know, but we should know.
That's right. And what was really disturbing, Chris, to me is when we started digging more into E.J. Edwards, as he was known as, when we started digging more into him, we found that it was actually hard to find information about him. The sources about him are very, very few and far between. Now, of course, you've got his writings that you can always look to, but the actual sources, secondary sources that talked about him were just so few. I mean, this is a guy, in my opinion, Chris, who deserves more time and research by historians.
You know, today we get most of our news from social media, through Facebook or Instagram or some other form, even from journalists on television. But back in the 19th century, and even when you and I were growing up, one of the things that was so important to give information out was the newspaper. It is how you knew what was going on, and some great stories come about through the competition between various newspapers. And we see that here today in this story as well. So I think our listeners are going to be introduced to a really fascinating study of an individual, but also how people are willing to do anything to make a dollar or to get their name in fame, or maybe keep it secret in the case of Grover Cleveland.
Right. I was about to say, get their name in lights or keep their name out of lights. People will do a lot to do one of the two, depending on the situation. Now, Elisha Jay Edwards is known, as I said, as E.J. Edwards. He was born in Norwich, Connecticut in 1847. He's the son of a relatively famous preacher at that particular time. But what is most interesting about him, at least to me, is that he is a distant relative of the great theologian of the Great Awakening, Jonathan Edwards. So if the name Edwards sounded, like, oh, I know some other people in history with that name, he is related to Jonathan Edwards. He graduated from Yale in 1870 and attended law school, I believe, there at Yale as well, and graduated in 1873. He opened a law practice that very year, but he quickly changed careers from law to media, from law to newspaper. And he's going to purchase stock shortly after opening a law practice in a New Haven, Connecticut newspaper called the Elm City Press. and then he's going to become a managing editor there at that particular newspaper. So he is going to go through a series of newspapers, Chris, as he's building his career. And it's going to be a number of very, I guess you could say, lucky events that's going to take him to where he would become most prominent.
It's all about who you know.
Right.
They can get you the places that you need to get to. And I think it was kind of an unexpected break that E.J. Edwards had when he had the opportunity to meet a man who was named Charles Dana, who was one of those towering figures, if you will, of American journalism during this time. You know, Dana is, once again, I think another figure that many people do not know of, because anybody that's familiar with history around this point have heard of Pulitzer and Hearst, and they understand the fight that was going on between those two newspaper brands. But really, Dana is the one who kind of really starts what's known as the penny paper,
Right.
where it would be this about 4 pieces of paper that would have all kinds of interesting stories that were sensational and gossip. And it was, just to give people great reading opportunities. And he would sell those pamphlets, if you will, for $1. But what Dana really liked about it is he wanted to be very eloquent. He wanted his newspaper to be high class. I think they were talking about it being literate. It was being poignant. It was groundbreaking. And Ray, here's something interesting that I didn't know, though I knew the story, but I didn't know how it all came about. But Dana was in charge of the New York Sun, and the New York Sun had a very weird style. And one of the editorial writers for the Sun was a man whose name was Francis Church, who was the one that gave a response to an 8-year-old girl named Virginia O'Hanlon, who had written to the paper asking a question: is there a Santa Claus? And this New York Sun editor, whose name was Francis Church, said, yes, Virginia, there is a Santa Claus. We've all heard that expression. We've all heard that story, but to see that came from this newspaper, which was owned by Dana, who would then pluck from obscurity this guy named E.J. Edwards, who at the age of 32 begins working at a New York newspaper, which, if we know anything from the Broadway musical Newsies, we know that that's a very important occupation in New York during this time period.
Yeah, and he's working in a newsroom with other reporters. And of course, you know, when I think about newsrooms, I think about telephones ringing and fax machines and typewriters or maybe even computers. But of course, it was a very different type of newsroom than that. They didn't have all of that technology. It was people really writing stories in longhand, which E.J. Edwards was known to do when he was there at the Sun. He would be quickly named the Washington, D.C. correspondent for the Sun newspaper, and he would go on to actually start using a typewriter, which some people call that newfangled technology. You know, those newfangled machines. I mean, we hear that today. You know, computers are just a fad. Don't really get too terribly attached to them. But he also really was a very good investigative reporter, which I think put him in a position to be able to go out and interview people and find the story and get to the heart of the story, and not just simply report stuff that was what we would today call clickbait, but be able to report things that maybe other people were missing.
Yeah, and you know, in our classes that we teach, focusing on American history, we actually talk about this investigative journalism that comes about. We use the term that who I think one of the greatest presidents, Theodore Roosevelt, would use, this muckraking, you know, where you're going to muck up all the stuff that is going on, all of the dirty stuff that's happening in politics. And what I thought was interesting is in our classes, we talk about Jacob Riis, who wrote this phenomenal book that was entitled How the Other Half Lives. when he's investigating the tenement housing in New York and how horrible the conditions were for these workers and where they lived and the terrible conditions that they had. Well, what's interesting is that Edwards actually worked with Jacob Rice in creating that. So here's once again Edwards still in obscurity in 2021, but yet people who have studied history or they've taken a class or two in American history probably know the name Jacob Rice. They probably know the photographs that came from that, the book How the Other Half Lives, and Edwards was right there with them, but nobody remembers him. So I think it's so important that we give this guy his 5 minutes of fame on our illustrious podcast.
That's right. He can rest easy in eternity because we
dug him up.
That's right. The poor man was resting peacefully until we got a hold of him. But he's going to actually be there at the Sun. And he's going to actually increase his reporting and his work is going to increase the circulation of the Sun. In 1889, after being with the Sun for, I think it was around 10 years, he's going to go to the Philadelphia Press. And he's going to be their New York correspondent. And it's there that he gets a reputation that reminds me of one of the targets of one of his early high-profile investigations. That was President Grover Cleveland. Because in Philadelphia, E.J. Edwards had a reputation for being fair and honest. But like you said, he was fair, he was honest, but he had no hesitation to expose corruption in business or dishonesty and corruption in politics, that muckraker, which of course was still several years out officially, but he was certainly doing that as early as 1880s, as he was there at the Philadelphia Press working for that particular newspaper. In fact, you talked about How the Other Half Lives. There's another famous piece of literature that he is connected to. In 1892, he met a young writer by the name of Stephen Crane. And this young writer, Stephen Crane, would go on to publish a book, a Civil War novel called The Red Badge of Courage. And Edwards, E.J. Edwards, was the guy who Crane took this book to and said, would you read this for me? And basically proofread it for me. And interestingly enough, Chris and audience, Crane was 21 years old when he wrote The Red Badge of Courage. And like you said, when talking about How the Other Half Lives, E.J. Edwards was right there.
Yeah, Stephen Crane didn't have a place to lay his head.
That's right.
He was poor. Nobody wanted his stuff. And so we have Edwards, who is this uplifter and is one of these hidden heroes in history, if you will. And you're exactly right. His publisher at the Sun, Dana, said that Mr. Edwards, quote, in whatever responsibility he had been tested, excelled. As a reporter, his work is beyond criticism. As an editorial writer, he is pungent and thoughtful. And as an executive manager, his career has been brilliant. So, I mean, it's not like he saw himself as, I'm just going to go and find all of the bad stuff and I'm just going to make everybody's life miserable. No, he was all about just reporting the news, or, as that famous show says, just the facts, ma'am. I mean, he was interested in showing how to make things become brought to news. They were newsworthy. And yet I think he also knew that he was going to get in trouble, because he had this desire to uncover corruption. And he also knew that it could come back to harm him. And so he took on like an alias, right? So a lot of his writings later on would be, I think his name was Holland is the alias that he used. And so later on, people started really enjoying his writing. And instead of saying, I wonder what E.J. Edwards has to say about this, they would say, well, what does Holland have to say? And so maybe E.J. Edwards gets lost in history because he takes on that pseudonym instead of taking on the real name E.J. Edwards. But as we're about to see, it's probably a reason why he decided to use Holland instead of his name.
Yeah, and we want to get into the first of the two major stories he was responsible for breaking, as we would say today. The first one occurred in August I believe it was August of 1893. Edwards is returning home to Greenwich after a vacation. His carriage is riding down the road, and a friend of his named Leander Jones flags down his carriage. And they stop and chat for a minute, and Jones pulls Edwards aside and basically says, something bad has just happened to the president. And he's talking about President Grover Cleveland. And Jones and Edwards go inside a building, and that's where Jones tells him the story of this surgery that has just been performed on a yacht on the president of the United States. And he gives him a name, a guy called Dr. Ferdinand Halsbrook. And he says, this is the guy you need to talk to get more information. And Halsbrook, if you remember from our episode on the surgery of Grover Cleveland, the president is a sick man, is the name of that episode. It's a few weeks back. Halsbrook was the dentist who helped remove the teeth on the upper left side of President Cleveland's jaw. And so Edwards is directed to go to Halsbrook, and he goes to Halsbrook, and Halsbrook, after some understandable hesitation, says, yeah, the story's true. This is what happened to the president. The president had a secret surgery aboard a friend's yacht without anybody knowing it. The president could very easily have died.
And what a moment of crisis for Mr. Edwards, because on the one hand, for his job, he's to report the news.
Right.
He's to investigate. And he didn't even know that Cleveland was necessarily sick. He had actually written an article saying, hey, he's going on a fishing trip, because that's kind of what he thought. And now he's been given some information that seems to go against everything that people has been saying. He's an investigative reporter. He uncovers things that, are kind of hidden way down deep. And so he's just been handed this scoop of the century, if you will. And yet he has to ask himself, if I publish this, what happens to the country? If I mention this, what happens to the president? What happens to me? And so when you think about the ethics of it, that's a big decision that Edwards has to wrestle with. But he chooses the right and noble thing. He investigates. He doesn't just go, he could have easily have gone and written the story without going and having the interview with Halsbrook. He could have just said, hey, it's what I heard, because isn't that what they do today? They don't go on fact. But he actually said, no, I'm going 3 steps further. He goes and he does diligent research. He finds all the information. He is adamant that he gets the story right, because he doesn't want to just publish untruth or half truth, but he's going to publish the full truth. Whether it's right or it's not, he's going to publish the truth. And so he goes, but yet he also has this what they called it, the beat, right? This story that would win him an award, that would win him prize, that would win him fame. And yet he publishes the story. And instead of everybody patting him on the back saying, hey, job well done, good job, you did wonderful, the next thing you know is everybody turns on him. Even though in the story he writes that the president is honorable, that the president is heroic, that the president has gone through all of this and he's tormented the pain, but he's still leading the country. Even though he puts the president in a good light, he still paints the picture of, y'all kept something from us. And Ray, they come after him with anything and everything.
Yes, they definitely do. The article is published on August 29, 1893. It is titled "The President, a Very Sick Man." And like you said, he goes through, his language is very reserved. He doesn't create, it's not sensational. It's not what we would today call clickbait. It's just very sort of straightforward narrative. And like you said, he does paint Grover Cleveland as a very honest man, a good man who really was just trying to protect the country, which is part of Grover Cleveland's motive in trying to keep this thing quiet. But you talk about the people who turned on him. One of them was a guy called Alex McClure. And McClure is going to spend the rest of his life really attacking Edwards. McClure was not some obscure man. He founded the Times in 1875. And he is going to attack E.J. Edwards quite a bit, calling him all sorts of names. I mean, the mudslinging that he's going to throw at Edwards is going to be very, very bad, very, very vicious.
Yeah, he wrote an editorial,
Yes.
and the name of the editorial was "A Disgrace to Journalism."
Yep.
And I mean, he just exasperates Edwards. And I mean, as you say, he calls him every name under the book and basically says, here's a guy who is misreporting, who is lying to you, the nation. It is the very depth of despicable journalism. I mean, he is trying to say that Edwards has faked it. He's we see so many fallacies with this. We see kind of a red herring where he says, well, look at this, trying to protect, the other side of things. And it's so sad because here is a guy just doing his job, but this other guy really goes after him. And Ray, I wonder if one of the reasons why there's so much animosity towards Edwards is not because of those two or even the story, but it's because of this newspaper competition that's going on right now, where individuals are really fighting for, the stake of the people buying newspapers from you, because it truly was a business. And I wonder if McClure, felt intimidated and maybe felt that he had to do this so that more people would flock to his readings rather than to the company Edwards was working for.
Yeah, I mean, responding to a breaking news story the way McClure did certainly is going to increase the number of people who are reading him, especially Democrats who like Grover Cleveland, supporters of Grover Cleveland, which McClure was. He was a hardcore supporter of Cleveland. So, yes, I'm sure there was newspaper competition that was at the heart of it, but I'm also sure politics was at the heart of it. It was, you attacked my guy, so now I'm going to attack you. And of course, that's something we see today all the time. Now, ultimately, and if you want to get into the details of the story about Grover Cleveland's surgery and how it all worked out, you can go back and listen to our episode, "The President is a Sick Man," from a few weeks ago. Ultimately, it's going to turn out, Chris, that E.J. Edwards was right. But that is not going to change McClure's attitude toward E.J. Edwards. He is going to remain hostile to Edwards. And when we get to the next issue, the Sugar Trust scandal, McClure is going to return and continue attacking E.J. Edwards just as ruthlessly as he had attacked him before.
Yeah, I think there's also something to be said about E.J. Edwards during this. So, I mean, he goes through so much. I mean, he had worked hard to build up his reputation. And he deservedly had it. I mean, he was a good writer, and yet this one incident, and I mean, they just continued to just pour on him. But I found it interesting that despite the way that Cleveland's allies treated him, despite how McClure treated him, and all of these other things, that Edwards never held it against the president. That even though the president could have taken this all away, he could have easily gone out and said, you know what, that guy was right. That guy was telling you the truth, and I tried to hide it, and here's why I tried to hide it. I'm going to be transparent now. I wasn't then. But even when Cleveland didn't do that, Edwards would still continue writing these really nice profiles of Cleveland, talking about that he was an honest man, talking about that he was a good man. He actually writes an article later on after this, and he says the only political fault of Grover Cleveland, he's honest.
Yeah.
Which is completely against everything that he's been saying. The guy has not been honest.
It's interesting that when McClure and others attack Edwards, it's almost like they can't see the forest for the trees, that they're so distracted by the fact he's saying something that might be construed as negative against the president, that they're missing the fact that his overall point is that the president was honest and trying to do what was right and all of that. But they were just so offended by what he said, by the fact that he exposed something, that they couldn't get past it.
Yeah, and if we think that's bad, I mean, that he exposed a serious illness with the president of the United States, which began this national debate over, the president's privacy. Where does the president have the right to privacy? Does the public need to know about health? But that has nothing in comparison to what I think was the second thing that he uncovered, which will truly not just affect the executive branch, but he goes towards the legislative branch, more specifically to the Senate, and he opens up a whole can of, I guess we would say, sugar.
Yeah, you can say sugar. There was a company at this particular point known as the American Sugar Refining Company. And it pretty much controlled the U.S. sugar industry. It was a coalition of 24 different refineries. They pretty much had a monopoly over the market of sugar. It's interesting how many times throughout American history, whether you're talking about the precursor to the American Revolution or here, that sugar is a major issue, that it actually becomes an issue that really pushes history forward. But anyway, they're pretty much dictating sugar prices. Planters who are growing sugar cane or whatever, they have to accept whatever prices the Sugar Trust puts on them, because if they don't get paid. Or the way it was put, they ate their own sugar. It was basically do it our way or hit the highway, is basically what this Sugar Trust was telling people. And you had this guy by the name of Henry Havmeyer, who owned the largest of the refineries in this Sugar Trust. And he was a sugar robber baron. This was not someone who you wanted to be friends with. He was certainly not someone you wanted to be working for. He was a really bad employer. In the summer of 1892, for example, 24 firemen who were responsible for keeping the boilers going in Havmeyer's refinery died from injuries and illnesses that came from being there near the boiler in that boiler room. The following June of 1893, Havmeyer lets go. He fires firemen for striking, and they're striking for the one reason, and that was to have fewer working hours in the summer when it's so hot outside. And what does he do? Like I said, he fires them. This is not a nice guy. This is not someone who was a good employer. This was someone who was a ruthless sugar baron, and he is going to play a big role in what's coming here with E.J. Edwards.
And, once again, we bring in politics, which is what you mentioned earlier. And here's where Havmeyer comes in, and because he had made so much money, he was able to invest $500,000 to the Democratic campaign. And let's be clear.
Of Grover Cleveland.
Of Grover Cleveland, yes.
Yep.
And let's be clear, he wasn't just giving $500,000 to Grover just as a gift.
Right.
He was giving him $500,000 saying, I'm giving this to you for your campaign. And it comes with the expectation that you guys are not going to endorse legislation that is going to hurt my sugar company. You're not going to cause me to lose money. So I'm giving you money. Now you've got to take care of me. It's that whole idea of I'll scratch your back, you scratch mine, that grafting that we'll talk about as we move forward.
Yeah, and you talk about corruption. We see corruption in today's politics. The level of corruption here, both in the Sugar Trust, but also in the government. They had a tariff, a 0.5-cent tariff on every pound of sugar that was imported into the United States. That was a differential tariff, which means the money raised from that tariff did not go to the federal government. It went to the Sugar Trust. It resulted in about $20 million per year of funds going to the Sugar Trust on top of their profits from their daily business. So this man, Havmeyer, was neck deep in corruption. He was getting a lot of money from these tariffs. And as you said, Chris, the last thing he wanted to see was Congress or the president do anything that would endanger that lucrative deal he had with the government. And in the fall of 1893, the very thing he dreaded happened when a bill was introduced in the House that would have eliminated the tariff that was giving so much money to barons like Havemeyer. And it's just going to be a really, really big danger to his profits. And when Democrats are meeting to discuss this particular bill that would change the tariff, the Secretary of Treasury under Cleveland came into the room, unexpectedly came into the room, and basically told the Democrats, no, you don't support this bill, or you find a way to change this bill, because if you support this bill, you're going to undermine some of our major supporters.
Yeah, and Edwards just happens to catch wind of this secret meeting with the Democrats and also the Secretary of Treasury. And the Secretary of Treasury is very careful. So we know that the way that this was done was purely manipulative, because he made sure not to invoke Grover's name. Right. He made sure that this was not coming from the President of the United States, but it was coming from the President of the United States, because $500,000 had gone into the president's coffers for the election. So it was coming, but it wasn't coming. And so, Edwards hears about this and he was like, oh my gosh, these, not only is the sugar companies going to make money, but there are senators who are going to make some money also, because they've got some investment in these sugar companies. And so all he does is what he's done all of his life. He just writes an article. He just exposes it. And it goes a step further, because now these senators are about to not just lose money, but they might lose their Senate seats, which are seats of power. And so all of a sudden, he gets a little letter saying, you'll report to this select committee by the Senate, and we're going to talk about this. And when he gets there, once again, he's a very honest guy. He just reports the facts. But there's one thing that all journalists will refuse to do, and that is that they're not going to give up their source. Because that is, I guess, and we're not journalists, but I guess that's like the number one rule of being a journalist, is you don't give up your source.
Yeah, because if you give up your source, who's going to talk to you in the future?
Right.
If you go before the Senate, a Senate committee, and you're questioned, and the first thing you do is give up your source, and your source gets in trouble, your source gets attacked, their name gets exposed, who's going to talk to you in the future? Nobody. Your credibility as a journalist is shot. And the thing that's really going to push the Senate to drag E.J. Edwards before this committee is that the final bill in that House, it didn't eliminate the tariff. It just cut the tariff a little bit. And instead of getting $20 million a year, the trust would get $15 million a year. And that's what Edwards reported. He is called before the Senate committee that's put together to testify about this in May of 1894. And Edwards, like you said, they're going to pressure Edwards. They're going to say, who was your informant? And Edwards is going to say, that I'm not telling you who my informant is. Edwards got a lawyer by the name of Abram Diffenhofer. I may have said his name wrong, but what he says is, and I quote, "It is unimportant for the committee, for the purpose of arriving at the truth of this alleged charge, to ascertain who informed Mr. Edwards. The question before the committee is whether the charge is true or false, not who gave the information," end quote. So what Edwards' attorney is saying is, look, it doesn't matter who told Edwards. What matters is you guys in the Senate, some of you, at least two of you, knew of the changes that were coming with the tariff and made investments based on those coming changes, and you were making money on those changes. So Diffenhofer, and I'm sorry if I'm messing up his last name, Dittenhofer, called the demand for the informant's name, and I quote, utterly unnecessary. And at the end of the day, Chris, Edwards, He refuses, absolutely refuses to give up the name. He is charged with contempt of Congress. I mean, that's something you really want to wake up in the morning knowing you've been charged with. But it's really weird because it's at this point that McClure comes back into the picture. McClure comes back into the picture at this particular point, and he makes more attacks on Edwards and Edwards' character and his journalistic standards. But between the time Edwards is charged with contempt of Congress and the time he actually has a trial, it's 3 years.
Yeah, and I think it just goes to show that when you're guilty, the only thing you know how to do is to go after the character, to go after the reputation of the one who has brought the information. And, that's what they do. As in that committee hearing, they hear from him, but as soon as they're finished with him, they bring in every senator who was implicated. And of course, they say, this guy's full of it. He doesn't know what he's talking about. And I mean, you have to think about this. You have senators that are testifying to their friends in the Senate. Edwards doesn't have a chance here. There's no way that he's going to convince a group of senators to go against their own group. I think we see that even in today's political arena, regardless of Democrats and Republicans. They might not like each other and they might not agree with each other, but there seems to be this unwritten rule that they protect each other. Somehow, some way, they always seem to protect the sanctity of the Senate body, whether it's right or wrong. They don't want there to be a black eye, if you will, on the Senate. And so if they have to, let's just kind of cut this Edwards guy. Let's find him guilty. Let's, do what we have to do with him. Yeah.
And the trial for E.J. Edwards was held, it was a very brief trial, held on June 18, 1897, 3 years after he published his article on the Sugar Trust corruption thing. And after just a few witnesses, I mean, literally just like 2 or 3 witnesses, the judge basically says the committee that had sent Edwards the summons to appear in court shouldn't have sent the summons, and therefore the summons was illegal and not legally binding. Thus, Edwards was found not guilty, and he would ultimately be vindicated. His account of the Sugar Trust scandal was corroborated by other reporters at the time. So just like with Grover Cleveland, once again, you have E.J. Edwards. He comes out. He's the sole person out there telling the story, and everybody's piling on to him. But Chris, once again, he's right. Because as we said earlier, he was a man who did his homework.
Truth always comes out at the end.
Yeah.
Sometimes you got to go a lot of bad places to get there, but it always comes out at the end. And, he goes on even after this. And while he lost a few good years, his reputation will grow back. He has the opportunity to continue his career, actually working with the Wall Street Journal that we're familiar with today. And, will continue to write and make an impact. But I do think that his name is lost in history for 2 reasons. Number one, because he was willing to let other people shine instead of him. And the second thing is the people who controlled the papers, McClure, the people who controlled the Senate, they didn't want his name out there.
Right.
They didn't want him to be remembered, because if he was remembered, what would be remembered were the things that he was investigating, and they didn't want that. So they tried to quash it. And I do think it's interesting that the Sugar Trust, after all of this, has to rename its name. And, you and I, we can still see remnants of the Sugar Trust today when you go into the grocery store. You go and look at that little bag of sugar, and there's a company called Domino, I think, right? Or Domino or something like that, Domino Sugar. So I don't know, Ray. It's been an interesting podcast, and that song comes to my mind, Pour Some Sugar on Me. But maybe
I was not going to go there, Chris.
But maybe what we did is we poured some history of E.J. Edwards onto our listeners, and maybe they enjoyed that sweet new story of history.
Yeah, I hope so. If our listeners would like to contact us, they can always email us at historyyousshouldknow@gmail.com. That's history, the letter you should know, @gmail.com. You can contact us on Facebook, Twitter. You can find our podcast on Sounder FM, Spotify, Google Podcast, or basically almost anywhere you get your podcast. Until next time, I'm Ray.
And I'm Chris.
We look forward to talking to you again soon.